Wonderful to be with you, and thank you, Zach, so much for organising this and inviting me to take part. My name is Nick Allen, and I'm a Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Oregon. And I'm also the co-founder of a digital mental health startup, which is relevant to this disclosure. And the issue that I wanted to focus on today is the question of how we can utilise mobile sensing methodologies in psychological treatment, and particularly with respect to personalisation of those treatments. So let's start out with the question of what's wrong with self-report. I mean, we use self-report extensively, and of course, it's very appropriate for a lot of the things that we want to focus on, because in mental health, you know, phenomenological experience is a big part of the phenomena that we really want to understand. But the difficulty with self-report are many. One is what we know that whenever we collect objective data on behaviour along with the self-report data, that we find that these things do not always correlate very highly, and sometimes they don't correlate at all. And you can see there's some examples here. There's been studies of condom use or of sleep or of substance use, where there's been an objective measure and a subjective measure, a self-report measure available, and we always see that the self-report data is not telling you the whole story. Secondly, of course, one of the big things, and this really relates, in my opinion, very much to some of the difficulties we have with engagement with digital products, is that self-report is effortful and therefore cannot be delivered that frequently, and particularly in a detailed way. And so as a result of this, there's been a lot of interest in the idea that mobile phone sensors are a method that provides objective and continuous measurement of behaviour, and that they may also be able to access aspects of behaviour that people either cannot or will not report during using self-report techniques. And so when this work began, one of the kind of great journalistic tropes, I think, that emerged out of this was that your phone could tell when you were depressed or anxious or whatever it may be. And you can see some examples here from this idea. So in other words, the general idea was that these data may act as biomarkers for the disease states, the disorders that we're interested in. Now, you know, and so this is what I call the first proposed killer app for mobile sensing. We can detect disorders and make diagnoses or estimate rating scale scores. Now, part of the problem with this is that, you know, we've been down this road before of searching for biomarkers of mental health problems. And perhaps one of the most well-known examples is that of biological psychiatry, where, of course, literally billions of dollars has been poured into methods like brain scanning or genetics, in order to find biological markers that can help us with diagnosis and treatment planning. And of course, as I think most people in the field recognise now, this has turned out to be a much more challenging task than perhaps people would have estimated when the whole project began. And this is a quote here from a paper in this year's Annual Review of Neuroscience, where they note that this is much more complicated than we might have hoped, and that the effort to find simple biomarkers of diagnostic entities has all but been abandoned. And so we need to make sure that we're not going to recapitulate some of the difficulties that this field has had. The second thing is that really, especially for people who are involved in behavioural treatments, diagnosis really doesn't help you a great deal. It doesn't get you very far in terms of treatment planning. And this is where this topic that I'm speaking about really speaks directly to the question of personalisation, which is the theme of our symposium. So, you know, what do clinicians really want? Well, clinicians generally think they're pretty good at making diagnoses, but what is a bigger challenge is how do you derive the insights that allow you to match your treatments? So, for example, in cognitive behavioural therapy, knowing that someone is depressed doesn't give you a lot of information about which specific methodologies you should be highlighting in your treatment planning. And of course, there's a big movement now towards trans-diagnostic treatment planning as opposed to diagnostic treatment planning, looking at these common mechanisms that might be under things like sleep, activity and exercise, social relationships, etc., substance use, and so forth. We also, a big clinical need is to understand recovery and functioning in people's day-to-day lives, and finally getting real-time feedback on people's progress to adjust therapeutic strategies. And so what this suggests is that, in fact, a more useful approach, rather than trying to predict diagnostic entities, may be to use mobile sensing to actually measure directly the behaviours, the constituent behaviours that we're interested in. And the good news is that this turns out to be a much more tractable problem for mobile sensing than predicting diagnostic states. So, for example, mobile sensing can be used to estimate sleep, patterns of physical activity, patterns of social activity, patterns of mobility, and many other features as well. And of course, there is a particular approach to treatment that's an inherently personalised approach to treatment called behavioural activation that really treats those kinds of data as their most key elements. So, you know, most of you will be familiar with behavioural activation. It's a very simple and straightforward approach to treatment that involves changing these negative cycles of increasing depression and behavioural withdrawal with cycles that involve behavioural activation and improving mood. And I would put it to you that behavioural activation has amongst the best empirical track records in psychological therapies, especially for depression. And just as one example of many that I could call on here, you can see this recent meta-analysis dismantling study that was published in Lancet Psychiatry earlier this year, showing that behavioural activation in terms of internet-delivered cognitive behavioural therapies for depression, that behavioural activation was, in a sense, the component that was most strongly associated with therapeutic improvement. So, putting all this together, we have been doing quite a lot of work in the area of mobile sensing, and what we are working on now is developing a system where essentially mobile sensing provides objective and continuous measurement of the components of behaviour that normally are required to be logged by the individual during the activity monitoring stage of behaviour. That's interesting. I'm getting a complaint about Teams on my Slack message there. And you can see, so this has advantages not only because the data is objective, but also because it is able to be collected without a participant burden or patient burden. And so, you know, and then the personalization component comes up, is that in the sense of being able to provide to the individual user feedback about which patterns of behavior specifically for them are associated with increased enjoyment on a day-to-day basis. And then those patterns of behaviour then can become part of the personalised treatment plan. Secondly, the system involves the capacity to share these data with the practitioner, and then the practitioner can build out a schedule of nudges and notifications that go out to support the behavioural activation plan in real time in the person's life. At the moment, with this particular system, it's largely built. We're working at the moment on some user-centered design evaluations to make sure that it has usability for both patients and practitioners, and also hardening up some of the data collection methods so that the data inferences that are being made are valid as we can make them. Anyway, with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention.